In the 2016 vice presidential elections, 16 out of the 17 cities in Metro Manila predominantly voted for Bongbong Marcos over the other candidates, and by huge margins as well. Why does Marcos still have so much support today? This is something I've been really thinking a lot about over the past, ever since Bongbong had so much support that time, but more seriously over the past year while reading different books. And I've been reading about the Marcos time period in the Philippines from many different perspectives. I've read perspectives from American historians. I've been read perspectives from Filipino historians, from nationalist historians, from Southeast Asian historians, from Cold War historians, from communist historians, of like global communist movements. I've read perspectives from global Maoist movements, from the perspective of leftist activists, from the perspective of reformers, from the perspectives of his own aides, just like in the Conjugal Dictatorship. And with all of these different perspectives I've been able to really think about, it's created a very complex point of view in terms of what martial law was like, or what martial law represented, or what the fall of martial law did to the consciousness of Philippine politics and Philippine democracy. And to be honest, the more I've been thinking about it, the harder it is for me to fully grasp everything. But I think I'm like at the tip, I'm at the edge of being able to really understand things in a way that I feel would be useful to look forward into the near future as well. But again, the core of the question is, where does the appeal for Bongbong Marcos come from? Where does it come from? I think that there is a disconnect between the average Filipino's perspective who lived through the Marcos administration, what is written in the history books or what is dominated in media about the Marcos administration today, and what can be how you can look at the situation from a more global perspective. Three perspectives that I think there's a lot of disconnect. If you were someone who was politically active during the Marcos administration, if you cared about politics, if you cared about journalism, or you cared about criticizing the administration, if you cared about free speech, you probably absolutely hated the Marcos administration because you were not able to exercise those impulses of wanting to really check what is going on and how our funds are being used and just how prevalent corruption was. If you cared about those things, the Marcos administration was absolutely the worst time in Philippine history. But I think that it's also likely that the majority of Filipinos were not political. Just like they may not necessarily be political today. Like, think about today, right? Think about the number of people you know personally that are generally apolitical, people who don't really think about politics very much. Probably more than you would like to really consider. This is probably just likely the case during the Marcos administration as well. The majority of people probably were apolitical, and people who were not so consciously negatively affected by the political oppression because they were not very involved with protests and all this stuff and underground kind of leftist movements. Most people probably just live their lives like most people do today, in a way where if you are not necessarily in communities that are afflicted by the drug war, you probably don't feel the drug war. In the same way that if you were not really politically inclined, you probably wouldn't feel the oppression towards leftists. The thing is that if you look at the literature that's been written or the media that has been talked about with the Marcos administration, a lot of the focus comes in the idea of this political repression, of the Marcos administration really not allowing people to express dissent against them. And that is a very true problem. But at the same time, if the majority of the people probably didn't really care about politics, they probably didn't care that they were being oppressed as well, just like many people don't care that people are being killed by the drug war. And their perspectives are probably just as valid and equal as the perspectives of those who were oppressed. What was going on during the martial law was that everyone was reading the same newspapers, or the newspapers that people did read all had the same kind of very heavy layer of censorship and propaganda, where people like Mijares, the author of The Conjugal Dictatorship, their jobs were to justify martial law being useful or being important or that it's working. The Philippine people are happy. People are not protesting. The people are doing well. And if you were reading the newspapers and you kept reading positive things, you would probably think, okay, I guess things are going well. Because right before the Marcos administration implemented martial law, it was a time filled with lots of chaos. Now, you may argue, and I think it's true, that the communist insurgency threats were exaggerated, meaning that there was no real threat that the communists would take over the country in 1972. But there was a lot of unrest still. There were a lot of strikes throughout the year, more than any time in Philippine history. There were a lot of student protests, first quarter storm stuff. There was a Muslim secessionist movement in Mindanao that was very violent and bloody. There was the Vietnam War, where we were sending troops to Vietnam and people were protesting about that. There were new points of view. The NPA was a real thing, although it didn't have the ability to take over the country. They were still there, they were still a thing. The book claims that the shipment of weapons from China was fake, but actually that's not true. MV Karagatan, it was a real ship that was, not today we know that there's evidence of communication between Season and China, literally asking for weapons. He writes that Marcos actually made it all up, but history says the opposite. So I don't know exactly how to make sense of his certainty that Marcos made that up with regards to the rest of the book's contents. But MV Karagatan was a real thing. So so whether or not the NPA had the ability to take over the country, they were trying to get weapons from China, and there was a spread of the ideology, although it was not widespread enough to really be able to kind of exercise power in the country. So there was real unrest before Marcos kind of did martial law. There were bombings, many of which were done by Marcos himself, but there was the perception of fear from the average person. Whether or not you think Marcos was doing the bombings or not, there were still bombings. It was not a good time. And the supermarkets were being blown up, people were getting injured, people were dying. And so, for many people, I can imagine that the establishment of martial law, the sense of more safety, was wanted. Even if Marcos was doing the bombings himself, or a lot of the problems that people were protesting about were by Marcos himself, the alternative of having relative quiet was probably, at the beginning, acquiesced. It was accepted by people who were not politically active. The description of, I'm reading from another book, and one of the descriptions that they said was like, the general feel of the time when he declared martial law for most people was, we'll wait and see. We don't know if it'll work, but we'll wait and see. Many people were afraid that Marcos was trying to stay in power forever. That was a real fear for many people who were politically active. But again, I think there's a difference between those who were politically active and the majority of the people who probably didn't care. Or the majority of people who were just living their day-to-day lives, wanting to, not thinking specifically about the structures of society that kind of compelled the problems that really influenced their lives. They probably just thought of like trying to make money every day, and that was the concerns of the Filipino people, probably for the most part. In the grander perspective, into the more kind of, if you kind of put the Philippines as just one example of a longer trend thing, every country in Southeast Asia was having an authoritarian system. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Thailand all had varying levels of authoritarian dictatorships. And Marcos's was actually one of the least supported by the country, arguably. But because of that, he was the one that was really able to get dissolved, because the ones in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, they didn't just dissolve in 20 years. They stayed much longer. Or, well, technically martial law was 14 years, and they dissolved. They dissolved after much longer period of time. So, but in general, during that time, what was happening was there was a Cold War where America was in Vietnam. People were sending troops to Vietnam. There was a sense of a domino theory where communism could spread from one country to another if communism took over the country. And so, for example, there's a Malaysian Communist Party. If they were able to take over the whole country, Malaysia will be a communist country, and it will kind of spread to Thailand, spread to the Philippines. And so every time you'd see communism, you'd want to stop it. And that was the idea. That was the United States perspective on things. And the Philippines was a very close United States ally. And so being anti-communist was what we were going to do anyway, because we had to be anti-communist, because we were heavily reliant on the United States for funding and all this stuff. And so whatever the United States political line was, we were going to follow it. What Marcos did was he exaggerated the communist threat so he could establish martial law before it became even an issue. If ever it would have been, because there's a possibility that communism would never have been an issue. There would have never been a real threat of the NPA taking over. So we would never have had the need to establish a dictatorship. But Marcos, what he did was he exaggerated the fear of it. He instigated many of the violence, and so he wanted to be a dictator sooner than later because Marcos had a term that was ending soon. He had to be replaced in 1973. Theoretically, if someone else became president in 1973, he could have established an authoritarian regime based on anti-communism as well, because maybe during his new term, that's when communism would have been more prevalent, if it would have ever been. But that never happened. But Marcos wanted to do it quicker than it would have ever been because he was running out of time. He was done with his second term. So he sped it up so that he can justify establishing martial law right now so he can still be president and still rule the country in a way that we didn't vote for him to do that. But in the general scheme of international trends, we would have probably gone in that direction anyway. But Marcos wanted to do it because while he was the president. So that was the situation at the time. And before Marcos became president, it was very tumultuous in the civil sphere. And after Marcos fell in people power in 1986, surprisingly, for me at least, and for people who may not have lived through that time, it became actually more politically tumultuous after Marcos left, because now that Marcos's dictatorship was gone, the military was not anymore running the country, it was a free-for-all of sorts. There was more unrest, there's more civil protests, there was more violence even. The military staged multiple coups against the Cory Aquino administration, so there was a lot of political instability. There was lots of social instability. There were stuff like Mendiola Massacre, where many farmers from Hacienda Luisita got murdered in front of the palace gates. And all these coups and stuff. There was a sense that things were more chaotic. During the Cory administration, there was a lot of brownouts, political, electricity shortages. It didn't seem like things were under control, and the result of that very tumultuous time under Cory Aquino is that in the next political election, the one who ended up winning the elections was Ramos, who was the head of the military under Marcos. The people wanted order again. Now, Ramos won by a very small margin, but the fact that he got, even the support that he got means that people wanted order again. So you get this period of order and stability for most of the people, and that was also very oppressive for people who wanted to speak out against the administration. You get lots of chaos, and then you get someone who comes into office who was part of the order situation, and then he's president again. Or someone who's, he becomes president. So you get this weird thing where it feels like it's easy to see why things may have felt safe or quiet given what happened before and after. So nostalgia for that time where things were, yes, politically repressive, yes, people couldn't have free speech, but if you were apolitical, it probably didn't matter as much, right? Now, what the problem I think is that when we think of the problems of Marcos, we focus too much on political repression when maybe we should be focusing more on the state of the economy, because that was what was affecting literally everyone. And it was not so good under Marcos. There are many things that went wrong during that time. We should focus on the corruption specifically of the family with Imelda and with his cronies, and there is a lot of focus on that. But how much focus can you really have on criticizing Marcos' cronies when so many of them are still the richest people in the country today? So many of the people who benefited from that time, from the top, from the military people to the businessmen, many of them continued on in success after the Marcos administration. All the blame went on one person, Marcos, and then everyone else who benefited from it, who were collaborators with it, who really were a big part of it, continued to maintain power. How can you really say that? And so when you talk about where does the Marcos kind of desire, my guess of where the I guess nostalgia for the period comes from, it's from this weird sense of I feel like for the majority of the population who probably wasn't very political, it was more peaceful, or it was more quiet than it was before and after. And because of how bad the last few presidents have been, or at least the ones that succeeded him with Arap and Gloria, it's easy to kind of see why maybe there's been a conspiracy behind the scenes of why are people saying that Marcos was all bad when I remember it being fine and I remember it being worse after. So there's this conspiratorial tone that can really be set. And I think that might be the seed that begins this whole kind of Bongbong Marcos thing, because people feel like they've been lied to by the people on top, by the news and the media, because their experiences may have different, may have been different from what is being reported.